The click of the door was the sound of a life breaking. For Taylor Vance, 8 months pregnant and full of hope, that sound was the starting pistol for a race she never knew she was in. She came bearing gifts of love and peace, a small surprise for her millionaire husband, Harrison Thorne. But the surprise was hers. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's about the moment a loving wife realizes her home is a boardroom, her marriage is a hostile takeover, and the woman sitting in her chair isn't just a mistress, she's a predator, aiming for the throne. What happens when the woman who helped build an empire discovers she's about to be demolished by it? Stay with us. The air in the private elevator of the Thorne Industries tower was so cold it felt like a warning. Taylor Vance clutched the small, elegant box of macarons from Le Ciel Patisserie, a little tighter, the warmth of the fresh pastries, a stark contrast to the chill seeping into her bones. At 34 weeks pregnant, every movement was a deliberate, weighty effort. A soft, insistent kick from within reminded her why she was doing this. For them, for their family, for the man she loved who had seemed so distant lately. Harrison Thorne wasn't just a husband, he was an event. A force of nature that had swept her up 7 years ago and placed her at the center of a glittering world she'd only ever read about. He built his tech empire from the ground up, and she had been there for every sleepless night, every risky investment, every triumphant breakthrough. She'd been his sounding board, his quiet strategist, his soft place to land. But the last 6 months had been different. The late nights became all-nighters. The hushed phone calls ended the moment she entered a room. The easy intimacy they shared had been replaced by a polite, almost professional distance. Harrison had blamed it on the stress of a massive new acquisition, a deal he called the legacy maker. Taylor, ever the supportive wife, had tried to believe him. She suggested a baby moon a weekend away before their son arrived. He had gently declined his hand, patting her swollen belly with a distracted air. "Soon, Elle, I promise. After this deal closes, it's just you and me and him." Today, however, a wave of loneliness had washed over her so profoundly it felt like a premonition. She'd found herself driving downtown, the box of his favorite salted caramel macarons on the passenger seat like a peace offering. A surprise visit, a small, desperate attempt to breach the walls he had built around himself. The elevator doors opened onto the 55th floor with a soft chime. The executive floor. The air here was different, thinner, scented with money, and a faint, sharp aroma of something floral she couldn't quite place. Harrison's executive assistant, a young, impeccably dressed woman named Clara, looked up from her desk, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Taylor, Mrs. Thorne, we weren't expecting you." "I know, Clara. Spontaneous," Taylor said, trying for a lightness she didn't feel. "I brought Harrison a little treat. Is he in a meeting?" Clara's eyes darted toward the imposing double doors of Harrison's office. "He is engaged. It's a very sensitive time with the acquisition." "Oh, I won't stay long. Just a minute to see his face." Taylor insisted, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The baby kicked again, a little drumbeat of impatience. Clara hesitated, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Perhaps I should just let him know you're here first." But Taylor was already moving, her maternal instincts overriding the polite protocols of the corporate world. "Don't be silly, Clara. He's my husband, not the president." She gave the young woman a warm, disarming smile and pushed open one of the heavy oak doors before Clara could protest further. And then time stopped. The office was a testament to Harrison's success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panorama of the city below. A sleek, minimalist space dominated by a massive mahogany desk that was more like a command center. Harrison was there, standing by the windows, his back to the door. But he wasn't alone, and a woman was sitting in her chair. It wasn't just any chair, it was the Eames lounge chair and ottoman in plush ivory leather that Taylor had gifted Harrison on their 5th anniversary. It was their chair. The one where she would sit and read while he worked late, their feet often tangled together. The one where they had dreamed up names for their future child. In it sat a woman who was the physical antithesis of Taylor. Where Taylor was soft curves and warm, approachable beauty, this woman was sharp angles and cool, predatory elegance. She was tall and slender, dressed in a form-fitting sheath dress the color of blood. Her dark hair was cut in a severe geometric bob, and her legs crossed with an air of absolute ownership seemed to go on forever. Her gaze, when it lifted to meet Taylor's, was not one of shock or guilt. It was one of bored assessment, like a queen examining a commoner who had wandered into the throne room. Harrison spun around his face a mask of horror. "Taylor, what are you doing here?" The air crackled. The floral scent Taylor had noticed earlier was stronger here, emanating from the woman in the chair. It was Baccarat Rouge 540, an expensive, intoxicating perfume that Taylor had once smelled on a scarf Harrison had brought home from a business trip to Paris 2 months ago. He'd claimed it must have belonged to a colleague from the airline. Taylor's hand fell from the doorknob. The box of macarons slipped from her other hand, hitting the plush carpet with a soft, pathetic thud. Her voice, when it finally came, was a choked whisper. "I could ask you the same question, Harrison." Her eyes were locked on the woman, who hadn't moved a muscle. The woman's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smirk. She uncrossed her legs, the whisper of nylon a gunshot in the silent room, and leaned forward slightly, placing her manicured hands on the arms of the chair, as if she were settling into a seat that had been hers all along. "Who is she?" Taylor breathed, though she felt she already knew the answer in the deepest, most terrified part of her soul. Harrison rushed forward, his hands fluttering uselessly. This isn't what it looks like. This is Isabella Rossi. She's my new COO. We were just going over the final details of the acquisition. You're misunderstanding." Isabella Rossi, the name was vaguely familiar, a rising star in the tech world known for her ruthless tactics. A shark. Isabella finally spoke, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. "I believe your husband is trying to say you've arrived at an inconvenient time, Mrs. Thorne." She didn't stand. She didn't acknowledge Taylor's advanced pregnancy. She held her ground, her posture a silent declaration of war. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it stole the air from Taylor's lungs. The intimacy of the scene she'd walked in on was undeniable. The way Harrison stood, the way Isabella sat, the charged energy in the room. It wasn't a business meeting. It was an occupation. Taylor looked from her husband's panicked face to Isabella's smug one. She looked at the chair, her chair now claimed by another. And in that moment she understood. The distance, the secrets, the lies. It wasn't about an acquisition. It was about a replacement. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind her. The click echoed down the hallway, a definitive, soul-crushing sound. It wasn't just a door closing. It was the end of a chapter, the end of a dream, the end of the life she thought she had. As she walked past Clara's desk, ignoring the assistant's horrified expression, a single cold thought solidified in her mind. This was not just an affair. This was a coup, and she had just been dethroned. The drive home was a blur of rain-streaked glass and the rhythmic, mocking thump of the windshield wipers. Taylor drove on autopilot, her mind a raging storm of images. Isabella's smug smile, the proprietary way her hands rested on the arms of the ivory chair. Harrison's face pale and slack with the shock of being caught. Each detail was a fresh stab of pain. By the time she pulled into the sweeping driveway of their modernist glass and steel home, her tears had dried, leaving behind a cold, hard residue of fury. She walked through the cavernous, silent house. Every object seemed to mock her. The abstract painting they'd bought in Santorini on their honeymoon, the sprawling custom sofa where they'd mapped out their future, the framed ultrasound photo on the mantelpiece, a smiling three-dimensional glimpse of their son. It all felt like a set piece in a play where she no longer knew her lines. She went to their master bedroom and stood before the walk-in closet, a vast space larger than her first apartment. She stared at Harrison's side rows of bespoke suits, shelves of gleaming leather shoes, a rack of perfectly pressed shirts. The faint, cloying scent of Baccarat Rouge 540 still clung to the air near his travel bag. It had been there for weeks, a ghost she had refused to see. Hours later, Harrison came home. He found her in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair, her hands wrapped around her belly, as if to shield their unborn child from the wreckage of their lives. The room was painted a soft, hopeful blue. A mobile of hand-carved wooden planets hung over the empty crib. He didn't rush in, didn't start with apologies. He leaned against the doorframe, his expensive suit looking rumpled and out of place. "Elle," he began, his voice low and cautious. "We need to talk." "Do we?" she replied, not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the planet Jupiter spinning slowly in the dim light. "I think the scene at your office was quite eloquent. You don't understand. It was not what you think." The classic cowardly opening line, a rage so potent it was almost dizzying, surged through Taylor. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Then tell me what to think, Harrison. Should I think it's normal for your new chief operating officer to be lounging in your private office in my anniversary gift, looking like she owns the place? Should I think her perfume ending up on your clothes is just a coincidence? Tell me. Build me a version of the truth I can live with. You're good at building things." He flinched but moved further into the room. "Isabella is aggressive. She's a brilliant operator, but she blurs lines. She makes herself at home everywhere. It's her M.O. It means nothing. I was handling it." "Handling it?" Taylor's laugh was a brittle, ugly sound. "It looked to me like she was handling you." "That's not fair," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "You're emotional. You're pregnant. You're seeing things that aren't there because you're feeling insecure." It was the gaslighter's masterstroke, turning her own vulnerability against her. He was using their baby, their shared joy, as a weapon to invalidate her reality. "Don't you dare!" she whispered, her voice trembling with the effort of keeping it level. "Don't you dare use our son as an excuse for your betrayal." He knelt before her, then taking her hands in his. His were cold. "There is no betrayal. Elle, look at me. I love you. I love this family we're building. This acquisition is the most stressful, high-stakes deal of my life. It's worth hundreds of millions. Isabella was brought in by the board to see it through. Her methods are unorthodox, but she gets results. That's all this is. Work. I swear to you." He looked sincere. The Harrison she knew, the man she had loved, was there in his eyes, pleading with her. For a dizzying moment she wanted to believe him. It would be so much easier to dismiss it all as the paranoid fantasy of a hormonal pregnant woman, to retreat back into the comfortable illusion of her life. "I need you to trust me," he said softly, placing a hand on her stomach. "For him. We can't let this stress affect the baby." She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She was a statue frozen by a conflict that was tearing her apart. "She was in my chair, Harrison. It's just a piece of furniture," he dismissed a little too quickly. "No," Taylor said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "It was a symbol, and you let her sit in it." He saw he was losing, so he switched tactics. The next day, a velvet box from Cartier appeared on her pillow. Inside was a diamond necklace, delicate and blindingly expensive. A text followed, "For the most beautiful mother-to-be in the world. I love you. Forgive my stress." The day after, a team of landscapers arrived to redesign the garden into the English rose garden she'd always wanted. He was trying to bury the truth under a mountain of expensive gestures. He was renovating the scenery, hoping she wouldn't notice the foundational rot. For a week, Taylor existed in a state of suspended disbelief. She allowed him to play the part of the doting, apologetic husband. They ate dinner together. He rubbed her aching back. They talked about the baby. But something had irrevocably shifted. The trust, once a solid, unshakable foundation, was now a web of hairline fractures. She would watch him type a text and wonder who it was for. She would smell his shirt when he came home searching for the phantom scent of Baccarat Rouge. The breaking point came a week after the confrontation. Harrison was in the shower. His phone, which was usually glued to his hand, lay on the bedside table. It buzzed. Taylor glanced over, her heart hammering against her ribs. A message preview glowed on the screen. It was from IR. The asset transfer is complete. Phase 1 is done. You handled the liability surprisingly well. Time to focus on what's important. Liability. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't even Taylor. She was a liability to be handled. And what was the asset transfer? The water in the shower shut off. Taylor's mind raced. She thought of Harrison's recent insistence that they consolidate their finances, moving her personal inheritance from a trust fund into a joint investment account he managed. He'd called it more efficient. At the time, she'd seen it as a sign of their partnership. Now it felt like something far more sinister. She picked up her tablet, her hands shaking. She logged into their joint investment portal. Her blood ran cold. 2 days ago, a sum of $5 million had been moved from the account. It wasn't transferred to Thorne Industries or any known subsidiary. It was wired to a numbered company she had never heard of, Argentum Holdings, LLC. She wasn't just being cheated on. She was being erased. This wasn't a simple, sordid affair. It was an operation, a meticulously planned conspiracy with her, their marriage, and her own money as collateral damage. Harrison wasn't just building a legacy. He was building it on the ruins of her life. And Isabella Rossi wasn't just the other woman. She was the architect. The fury that had been a slow-burning ember in Taylor's chest now roared into a conflagration. The hurt was still there, a deep, cavernous ache, but it was now sharpened by a terrifying clarity. She was not a victim of a cheating husband. She was the target of a corporate raider who happened to be sleeping with the CEO. The term liability echoed in her mind. It was cold, impersonal, and utterly dehumanizing. It was the language of a business deal, not a marriage. Her first instinct was to confront Harrison, to throw the tablet at his chest, and demand an explanation for Argentum Holdings. But the woman who had naively walked into his office a week ago was gone. That woman was trusting. This woman, the one staring at the multi-million-dollar hole in her life, knew that a direct confrontation would only be met with more lies, more gaslighting. Harrison and Isabella had underestimated her. They saw a soft domestic creature easily placated with diamonds and roses. They had forgotten the woman she used to be before Harrison Thorne. Taylor Vance, the art history graduate who had worked as a provenance researcher for a major auction house. Her job had been to trace the history of objects, to follow the paper trail through centuries of deception, theft, and war. She was trained to spot forgeries both on canvas and in documents. It was time to resurrect that woman. Her first call was not to a lawyer but to an old friend from her auction house days. Chloe Evans was a forensic accountant, a woman who could make numbers sing and balance sheets confess their sins. They hadn't spoken in months, a casualty of Taylor's all-consuming new life, but Chloe answered on the second ring. "Elle, is that you? You sound different." "I need your help, Chloe," Taylor said, her voice low and urgent. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "And I need you to be discreet, utterly." She explained the situation in clipped, precise terms, stripping it of emotion and presenting it as a case study. The powerful husband, the new COO, the suspicious text, the shell company, the $5 million transfer from an account containing her own inherited funds. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. "Ellie, you've walked into a snake pit. Argentum Holdings sounds vaguely villainous. Give me the details. The wire transfer number, the date, the name of the receiving bank. I'll see what I can dig up. But listen to me." Chloe's voice became serious. "Do not let him know you suspect anything. From this moment on, you are an actress. You are the happy, oblivious, pregnant wife. You smile, you rub your belly, You ask him what he wants for dinner. You do not give him any reason to suspect the liability is developing teeth. The advice was chilling but necessary. That evening when Harrison came home, Taylor was waiting for him, a warm smile on her face. She had cooked his favorite meal, osso buco. She asked about his day and didn't flinch when he mentioned Isabella's name in a work context. She played the part of her life, and it was the most harrowing performance she had ever given. She felt like a spy in her own home. While Harrison slept, Taylor worked. Armed with a new untraceable laptop and a secure internet connection, she began her own investigation. She started with Isabella Rossi. The woman's public profile was impeccable. A Wharton graduate, a series of spectacular successes, turning around struggling tech firms, a reputation for being brilliant and utterly ruthless. But Taylor wasn't interested in her resume. She dug deeper, scrolling through years of social media news articles and industry forums. She found a photo from a tech conference in Berlin 3 years ago. Harrison had been a keynote speaker. In the background of a group shot, partially obscured, was Isabella watching him with an intensity that was anything but professional. The affair, Taylor realized with a sickening jolt, wasn't a recent development. It was a long game. Isabella hadn't just appeared in their lives. She had been targeting Harrison for years. Then she turned her attention to the finances. Using the access she still had, she began downloading statements, years of them. Credit cards, investment accounts, household expenses. It was a painstaking, soul-crushing process. Every line item was a potential clue, a piece of the mosaic of deceit. A charge from a florist in a city Harrison had never mentioned visiting. A hotel bill from a weekend he was supposedly on a solo fishing trip. And then she found the pattern. Small, regular cash withdrawals from a joint account, always from an ATM near a particular downtown condo building. Never large enough to raise an eyebrow on their own, but over 2 years they added up to tens of thousands of dollars. A secret slush fund. Chloe called back 2 days later. "I've got something on Argentum Holdings," she said, her voice tight. "It's a ghost, incorporated in Delaware 6 months ago. The listed director is a man named Michael Stone, but I ran a check on him. He doesn't exist. The address is a P.O. box. It's a classic shell designed to be anonymous, but I got a lucky break." "What is it?" Taylor asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "The initial funding to open its corporate bank account. It wasn't Harrison's money. It was a wire transfer from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account belonging to Rossi." Taylor's breath hitched. "Isabella funded it." "She opened the door, Ellie. Harrison walked through it with your $5 million. But it gets worse. I pulled the public trading logs for the last few months. Argentum Holdings hasn't been sitting idle. It's been buying something, quietly, in small strategic blocks to avoid attention." "Buying what?" Chloe took a deep breath. "Shares. In a company called Innovate Dynamics." The name hit Taylor like a physical blow. Innovate Dynamics wasn't just any company. It was Thorne Industries' biggest and most formidable rival. Their co-founder and CEO, David Chen, was a brilliant engineer who had been in a fierce public battle with Harrison for market share for years. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying snap. This wasn't about expanding Thorne Industries. A company doesn't use a secret off-the-books shell corporation funded by an executive's mistress and marital assets to do business. This was something else entirely, something personal. They weren't planning an acquisition, they were planning a hostile takeover. A stealth attack on Harrison's greatest rival, using his own wife's money as the ammunition. And the new entity, the one that would rise from the ashes of this corporate war, would be Argentum Holdings, a company controlled by Isabella, funded by Taylor with Harrison as her willing partner. Taylor hung up the phone, a wave of nausea washing over her that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. The face staring back was pale and drawn, but the eyes were hard as flint. The game had changed. They weren't just trying to erase her from the marriage. They were using her to build a new empire, one where she would have no place, No claim, no future. It was the ultimate betrayal not just of her heart, but of her legacy. She had been the silent partner in building Thorne Industries. Now she was the unwilling financier of its successor. The revelation that she was unwittingly funding a secret war against her husband's biggest rival shifted something fundamental inside Taylor. The personal pain of betrayal, while still a raw, open wound, was now overlaid with a cold, strategic anger. This was bigger than a broken heart. This was grand larceny disguised as a boardroom power play. Harrison and Isabella weren't just destroying a marriage. They were playing with lives, careers, and the stability of an entire industry, all funded by stolen money. Her money. She knew she was at a critical juncture. She had the what, a hostile takeover plot. She had the how, the shell company Argentum Holdings. But she didn't have the why. Why the secrecy Thorne Industries was a behemoth. If Harrison wanted to acquire a rival, he had the legitimate corporate muscle to do it. Why resort to this back-alley cloak-and-dagger scheme that put him, the company, and her at such enormous risk? The answer, she suspected, lay in the very foundations of the empire they had built together. Chloe's voice echoed in her head. You are an actress. The role was becoming more difficult to play. Every shared meal was a performance. Every feigned smile felt like a betrayal of herself. Every time Harrison touched her belly and spoke of their future, a black, bitter bile rose in her throat. She was a vessel for their child and simultaneously the vessel for their deception. The irony was suffocating. She realized she couldn't continue alone. Chloe was her financial eyes and ears, but she needed someone who understood the legal labyrinth of corporate governance. She needed a weapon. That weapon had a name, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was Harrison's older brother, and the two were like oil and water. Where Harrison was a slick, charismatic empire builder, Marcus was a quiet, principled corporate lawyer who had left the family business years ago after a bitter falling out over Harrison's ethically flexible business practices. He now worked as in-house counsel for a nonprofit. He and Harrison had not spoken in years, but he had always maintained a soft spot for Taylor, seeing her as a grounding force for his volatile younger brother. He'd sent a beautiful handcrafted crib for the baby just last month, with a simple handwritten note, "May this child have his mother's heart and integrity." It was a huge risk. Contacting Marcus could blow the entire thing open, but she was running out of options. She drove to a small independent coffee shop halfway across town, bought a burner phone with cash, and made the call. Marcus, it's Taylor. There was a pause. Taylor, is everything all right? You sound stressed. Is it the baby? The baby is fine, she said, her voice tight. Marcus, I am in terrible trouble. Harrison is in terrible trouble, and I need a lawyer I can trust implicitly. I need you. She met him that afternoon in a secluded corner of a public library, the scent of old paper and dust a strange comfort. Marcus, with his thoughtful eyes and tweed jacket, looked more like a university professor than a shark. But when Taylor laid out the evidence, the printed bank statements, the notes on Argentum Holdings, the details of the share purchases, the text from IR, his expression hardened, the gentle academic replaced by a razor-sharp legal mind. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled before him. When she finished, he was silent for a full minute, his gaze distant. He's using marital assets to fund a secret off-the-books hostile takeover bid with his COO, Marcus stated, not as a question, but as a grim confirmation. And your inheritance was the seed money. My God, Taylor. Why Marcus? She pleaded. Why would he do it this way? Why the shell company? Why the risk? Marcus leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. Control and greed. A legitimate takeover bid through Thorne Industries would be subject to board approval, to shareholder votes, to SEC oversight. It would be scrutinized. There would be questions. But if he and Rossi acquire Innovate Dynamics personally through a private entity like Argentum, they own it outright. They can merge it, strip it for parts, do whatever they want without answering to anyone. But it's illegal, Taylor stated. It's more than illegal. It's a catastrophic breach of his fiduciary duty as CEO. Marcus explained, his eyes flashing with anger. He's using company resources, his time, his knowledge, likely inside information to enrich himself personally. And he's entangled you in a massive conspiracy. If this blows up, you as a partner in the joint account that funded it could be implicated in securities fraud and illegal acquisition schemes. The room seemed to tilt. She had been so focused on the betrayal that she hadn't fully grasped her own legal peril. They hadn't just made her a victim, they'd made her an unwilling accomplice. "What do I do?" she asked, the weight of it all pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. "We need more," Marcus said, his mind clearly working, mapping out a strategy. "We need irrefutable proof that ties Harrison directly to Argentum. We need to understand the end game. What is their final move? And we need to find the original documents." "What original documents?" "The founding documents for Thorn Industries," Marcus said. "I was there, remember? At the very beginning. You weren't just a supportive wife, Taylor. That first round of angel investment, the $50,000 that got the server running, that came from the trust your grandmother left you. You were a seed investor. Your name should be on the initial partnership agreements." A memory, hazy and distant, surfaced in Taylor's mind. A late night in their tiny apartment years ago. A pile of papers. Harrison saying, "It's just legal boilerplate L sign here and here. We're in this together." She had signed full of love and trust, never reading the fine print. I think I remember," she stammered. "He told me we were partners." "Let's find out how he defined partner," Marcus said grimly. "Those documents are likely in a vault either at his office or with his corporate law firm. Getting them will be difficult, but they could be the key. If your name is on them as a founding partner, you're not just a wronged wife. You are a co-owner of the entire empire, and you have rights he has systematically violated." Taylor left the library feeling a strange mixture of terror and empowerment. She now had a team, Chloe the financial bloodhound and Marcus the legal strategist. They were her allies in the shadows, fighting a war Harrison and Isabella didn't even know had been declared. The mission was no longer just about survival. It was about reclamation. She wasn't just fighting for her money or her marriage anymore. She was fighting for her very identity, for the truth of her role in the creation of Harrison's world, a world he was now trying to burn to the ground with her inside it. The actress had her script, and the next act was about to begin. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like an elaborate prison. Every corner held a memory now tainted. Every shadow seemed to hide a lie. Taylor moved through her days with a placid, serene mask, a perfect portrayal of the expectant mother nesting before the storm of childbirth. Inside, however, a glacial calm had settled. The emotional tempest had passed, leaving behind the cold, hard landscape of resolve. She was no longer just reacting. She was hunting. The hunt for the founding documents became her obsession. Marcus was right, they were the key. They were the legal proof of her very existence in the narrative of Thorn Industries, a narrative Harrison was actively trying to erase. Marcus began a subtle legal probe, sending carefully worded inquiries to Harrison's law firm, citing the need for estate planning due to the impending birth of an heir. It was a plausible pretext, but one that was met with stonewalling and delays. The documents were in deep archival, they were told. Retrieving them would take time. It was a polite corporate no. Taylor knew they wouldn't get them through official channels. Harrison or Isabella had likely already given instructions to bury them. So she turned to a different kind of archive, her own memory. She thought back to the early days, to the cramped apartment that served as their first home and office. Where would Harrison have kept something so important? He was a man of habits even then. He was also a man who believed in backups and redundancies. A digital copy. There had to be a digital copy. Her mind went to the old server. Before the gleaming racks in the Thorn Tower data center, there was the Chimera, a custom-built server that lived in their coat closet, its fans a constant hum in their small apartment. It held their entire life business plans, code repositories, financial models, and personal photos. When they moved into their first real office, the data was migrated and the old server was decommissioned. Harrison, ever the sentimentalist about his own creations, had refused to scrap it. "It's the cornerstone, Elle," he'd said. "You don't throw away the cornerstone." She found it in the climate-controlled storage room in their basement, tucked away under a dust cover behind boxes of old prototypes. It was an ugly beige tower, an ancient relic in the fast-moving world of tech. But to Taylor, it was a time capsule, a digital ghost of their shared past. Getting it running was a challenge. The power supply was archaic, the connections obsolete. She spent 2 days researching old tech forums, ordering obscure cables online with a prepaid credit card, her burgeoning belly a constant awkward obstacle as she worked on the floor of the basement. Finally, one evening, while Harrison was at a late dinner with the board, she powered it on. The old fans whirred to life with a groan, and a basic text-based operating system flickered onto the small monitor she'd set up. There was no graphical interface, no easy search bar. It was a digital maze of directories and subdirectories. For hours she navigated the command line, her fingers remembering the old codes, digging through layers of forgotten files. She found their first business plan full of typos and audacious dreams. She found photos from their first vacation, two young, hopeful people squinting into the sun. Each file was a small, painful reminder of the man he used to be, of the us that had once existed. And then she found it, in a password-protected, encrypted folder labeled Genesis. Her heart hammered. The password. What would it be? She tried the obvious ones. Their anniversary, her birthday, the company name. Nothing. She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back in time. What was important to him then? What was his world? It wasn't about money or success yet. It was about an idea. An idea he had named Project Icarus. She typed it in. ICARUS. Access granted. The folder opened, revealing a handful of scanned PDF files. The first one she clicked on was titled Thorne Vance Founding Partnership Agreement.pdf. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and there it was, in stark black and white. A legal document drafted by a small local law firm dated 7 years ago. It clearly stated that Thorne Industries was formed as a general partnership between Harrison Thorne and Taylor Vance. It detailed her initial seed investment of $50,000 and in exchange granted her a non-dilutable 40% equity stake in the company. 40%. She scrolled down to the signature page. There was Harrison's arrogant scrawl, and there was hers, a little hesitant but undeniably her own. She felt a dizzying wave of vindication so powerful it almost buckled her. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a supportive wife who had been along for the ride. She was a co-founder. She owned nearly half of the entire damn company. The second document she opened was the one that broke her heart all over again. It was titled Corporate Restructure Resolution. PDF dated 2 years later, right after their first major round of venture capital funding. It was a resolution to dissolve the original partnership and reincorporate as a C-Corp, the standard move for a growing tech company. It listed Harrison as the Class A voting shareholder with a 95% stake. It listed her, Taylor Vance, as being issued a small number of common shares amounting to less than 1% in exchange for her previous contributions. Attached to it was a signature page. Harrison's was there, and below it was hers. A perfect digital forgery. She stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. He hadn't just diluted her stake. He had erased her. He had taken her 40% and reduced it to almost nothing, using a forged signature to do it. He had committed blatant, premeditated fraud against his own partner, his own wife, years before Isabella Rossi had ever sat in her chair. This was the why. This was the original sin upon which his entire empire was built. The secret takeover of Innovate Dynamics wasn't a new plan. It was an echo of his first, most successful hostile takeover, the one he had perpetrated against her. He couldn't use Thorne Industries for his new scheme because a deep dive during due diligence might unearth this original fraud. He needed a new clean entity, Argentum, built on a fresh lie funded by a fresh betrayal. Isabella wasn't the architect of his downfall. She was just a partner in his preferred method of business. The man Taylor had married had never really existed. He had been a phantom, a construct, a lie she had helped build and decorate. A profound, chilling calm settled over her. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant hum beneath the surface, but the shock was gone. The game was no longer about winning back a husband or saving a marriage. It was about justice. It was about exposing the ghost in the machine, the lie at the heart of it all. She carefully copied the files onto a secure encrypted thumb drive. She had her proof. She had her weapon. And now she was going to war. For the next week, Taylor moved with the chilling precision of a bomb disposal expert. Her home was no longer a prison. It was a stage, and she was in the final rehearsals for her closing performance. Every interaction with Harrison was now a data point, every feigned smile a carefully calibrated maneuver. He remained oblivious, consumed by his secret war, convinced his liability was safely handled, cushioned by luxury and impending motherhood. He had no idea the real war was about to be waged in his own boardroom. With Marcus and Chloe, Taylor crafted a meticulous battle plan. Chloe tracked the movements of Argentum Holdings in real time. They were accelerating their purchases of Innovate Dynamics stock, growing bolder as they neared a controlling interest. The takeover was imminent. Marcus, armed with the explosive evidence from the Genesis folder, prepared a legal case so airtight it was a veritable fortress. They weren't just aiming to stop Harrison. They were aiming to dismantle his entire architecture of lies. The chosen battlefield was the quarterly board meeting of Thorn Industries. It was Harrison's arena, his throne room where his power was absolute. To confront him there was to challenge the king in his own court surrounded by his loyalists. It was audacious, bordering on insane, but it was the only venue that would have the immediate cataclysmic impact they needed. Taylor's plan required one more ally. A person on the inside of that boardroom. She chose Arthur Pennington, the oldest member of the board, a stern old money investor who had been a friend of her father's. Arthur was a stickler for ethics and corporate governance, and he had privately expressed concern to Taylor months ago about Harrison's increasingly reckless ambition. He had a reputation for being unshakable. 2 days before the meeting, Taylor met Arthur for tea. She didn't lead with the affair or the emotional betrayal. She laid out the facts as a business case. She presented him with a summarized, heavily redacted brief prepared by Marcus. The formation of Argentum Holdings by an executive officer. The illicit transfer of funds from a marital account containing seed money, the systematic off-the-books purchase of a rival's stock, and the grave legal and financial exposure this represented for Thorn Industries and its shareholders. Arthur read the document, his face growing progressively grimmer. "This is corporate malfeasance on an epic scale," he said, his voice low. "Harrison is acting like a rogue state. Who is the executive officer?" "Isabella Rossi," Taylor said quietly. Arthur nodded slowly as if a missing puzzle piece had just clicked into place. "She was forced on the board by the new venture capital firm. I never trusted her. She has the eyes of a predator." He looked at Taylor, his gaze sharp. "This document mentions marital funds and seed money. This is personal for you, isn't it, my dear?" Taylor met his gaze without flinching. "Arthur, what I am about to show you cannot leave this table until the board meeting. It will not only prove the case, but will redefine the very ownership structure of this company." She slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the signature page from the original Thorne-Vance founding partnership agreement. His eyes widened as he saw her name, her signature, and the 40% stake. "My God," he whispered. "You're not the CEO's wife. You're the co-founder." "A co-founder who was systematically defrauded," Taylor said, her voice like ice. "He is building a new empire with my money on a foundation of fraud against me. I am asking you to help me reclaim what is mine and protect the company we both care about from the man who is trying to destroy it." Arthur folded the paper and handed it back, his decision made. "What do you need me to do?" The morning of the board meeting. Taylor dressed with the care of a general preparing for battle. She chose a simple, elegant navy blue maternity dress, a color of authority and calm. She did her hair and makeup with understated perfection. She was not the weeping, hysterical wife. She was Taylor Vance's co-founder. She arrived at Thorn Tower and walked past the receptionist, her bearing so confident that no one dared to stop her. She could feel her son kicking a steady rhythmic beat as if he were drumming up courage for them both. Marcus was waiting for her in a small conference room down the hall from the main boardroom, the full set of documents in his briefcase. In the boardroom, Harrison was at the head of the table in his element. Isabella Rossi was seated to his right, a picture of cool, untouchable power. The meeting began, proceeding through the standard agenda items. Harrison was charismatic, commanding, painting a rosy picture of the company's future. Then Arthur Pennington cleared his throat. "Harrison, before we move on to the forward-looking statements, there is a matter of urgent and grave importance that has been brought to my attention regarding a potential breach of fiduciary duty by executive officers." A confused murmur went through the room. Harrison's smile tightened. "Arthur, what is this about? If you have a concern, you should have brought it to me privately. I'm afraid this is a matter for the entire board," Arthur said, his voice ringing with authority. He looked towards the door. "And for the company's primary and as yet unacknowledged co-founder." On that cue, the boardroom doors opened. Taylor walked in. The silence was absolute. Every head turned. Harrison froze, his face draining of all color. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. Isabella's mask of serene superiority cracked, a flicker of pure fury flashing in her eyes before being replaced by cold calculation. "Taylor!" Harrison stammered, rising slightly from his chair. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private meeting." "I believe I have a right to be here," Taylor said, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. She walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Harrison and stood behind it. "As the owner of 40% of this company," she placed a single file folder on the table in front of her. The sound was like a gunshot. "What is she talking about?" a board member asked. "She's confused," Harrison said quickly, trying to regain control. "She's not well. She's pregnant, and I have never been more well or more clear in my entire life." Taylor cut him off, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "I have here the original founding partnership agreement for Thorn Industries, signed by myself and Harrison Thorn. It grants me a 40% equity stake. I also have the documents from the subsequent incorporation, which includes my forged signature illegally reducing my stake to less than 1%. A fraud upon which this entire company has been operating." She slid a copy of the documents down the long mahogany table. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "we have evidence that Mr. Thorn and Ms. Rossi have been operating a shell corporation, Argentum Holdings, funded by $5 million illegally transferred from a joint marital account. They have used this entity to attempt a secret hostile takeover of our chief competitor, Innovate Dynamics, thereby putting this entire company at catastrophic legal and financial risk." She looked directly at Harrison, whose face was now a ghastly shade of gray. "You didn't just cheat on me, Harrison. You stole from me. You stole from this company. You stole from our son." Then she turned her ice-cold gaze on Isabella. "And you. You are not a COO. You are a corporate parasite who conspired to commit fraud. I suggest you call your lawyer." The room erupted. It was chaos. Board members were shouting. Harrison was speechless, collapsing back into his chair. Isabella stood up abruptly, her face a mask of cold fury, and walked out of the room without a word. Taylor remained standing, her hand resting on her belly. She had done it. She had walked into the heart of his power and detonated the truth. The coup was complete. But it wasn't her coup. It was his. And she had just exposed it to the world. The boardroom detonation was swift. The board, led by Arthur Pennington, immediately suspended Harrison and terminated Isabella Rossi, who was unceremoniously escorted from the building. As the story of executive overreach broke in the financial press, Thorn Industries' stock plummeted, and the empire built on lies began to crumble. Harrison's attempts to contact Taylor were a pathetic mix of fury and pleading, but she remained unmoved. He was a ghost from a life she no longer recognized. With Marcus as her counsel, Taylor negotiated not a divorce settlement, but a reckoning. Faced with irrefutable proof of fraud and the threat of criminal charges, Harrison capitulated. The original sin was rectified. Taylor's 40% founding stake in Thorne Industries was restored. She wasn't an ex-wife taking a payout. She was a co-founder reclaiming her kingdom. Harrison was left a wealthy exile vanquished from the world he once ruled. Taylor's goal was never to sit on Harrison's throne. She placed her massive block of shares into a trust for her son, took a permanent seat on the board as a guiding guardian, and installed a new CEO. 3 weeks later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Ethan, a name meaning strong. Holding him, a profound peace washed over her. The battles were over. 6 months later, Taylor stood in the living room of a new home, a warm, light-filled brownstone filled with the scent of baby powder and the sound of her son's happy gurgles. She had guided Thorne Industries through its recovery from a distance, hearing only whispers that Harrison had disappeared overseas. She had walked into his office a victim, but emerged a victor. She had been dethroned from a sham marriage only to build a true and powerful throne of her own, one of integrity, strength, and quiet peace. As Ethan's tiny hand wrapped around her finger, she knew this was the only empire that had ever truly mattered. From the ashes of a devastating betrayal, a new strength was forged. Taylor's journey shows us that the deepest wounds can often lead to the most profound discoveries of self-worth and power. It's a reminder that a person's value is never determined by someone else's deception. She didn't just win a divorce. She won back her identity, her legacy, and the right to build a future on her own terms, a future of truth for her son Ethan. For a decade, Catherine Davenport was the perfect millionaire's wife. She was an elegant, silent accessory on the arm of her titan of industry husband, Alistair Finch. While he and his brazen mistress, Crystal Vance, built a life of glittering excess, they saw Catherine as little more than a relic, a piece of old money furniture in their modern world. They mocked her quiet grace in whispered jokes at galas and laughed at her traditional values behind the closed doors of their shared penthouse. They were convinced they held all the power, all the money, and all the future. But they made one fatal mistake: they never once looked into the history of the fortune they were so proud of. What happens when the trophy wife they dismissed holds the key to the entire empire? And what happens when she decides to turn that key? The air in the penthouse, perched 60 stories above the glittering sprawl of downtown Chicago, was always chilled to a precise 68 degrees. It was a temperature Alistair Finch had decided upon, just as he had decided upon the stark white marble floors, the minimalist German furniture that looked better than it felt, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city he believed he owned. Catherine Davenport Finch had long ago learned to wear cashmere sweaters indoors. Tonight the chill felt particularly biting. It was the night of the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala, an event Catherine had chaired for the past 5 years. It was her one domain, a corner of their gilded life, where she felt a sense of purpose. Her family, the Davenports, had been patrons of this hospital for 3 generations. It was in her blood. Alistair stood before the vast plate-glass window, a flute of champagne in his hand, looking not at the view, but at his own reflection. He was a handsome man, sculpted by expensive personal trainers, and tailored in a Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars. His success was his identity. Finch Global, the private equity firm he'd built, was a behemoth swallowing up smaller companies with a ruthless efficiency that Wall Street both feared and admired. "Are you ready, darling?" he asked, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of impatience. He didn't turn around. Catherine clasped the necklace around her neck. It was a sapphire and diamond piece, a Davenport heirloom passed down from her grandmother. It was understated, elegant, and heavy with the weight of memory. "Almost," she replied, her voice soft. That's when Crystal Vance made her entrance. She didn't walk into the room. She burst into it, a whirlwind of sequined gold fabric, a cloud of Tom Ford perfume, and a laugh that was just a little too loud. Crystal was Alistair's executive vice president. That was her official title. Her unofficial one, known to everyone in their circle, was his mistress. "Allie, darling, you look like a king surveying his kingdom." Crystal purred, sliding up beside him and placing a perfectly manicured hand on his chest. Her dress was cut daringly low, a stark contrast to Catherine's classic navy blue gown. Alistair finally turned, a genuine smile gracing his lips for the first time that evening. "And you look like the Queen," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over Crystal in a way he hadn't looked at Catherine in years. Catherine felt the familiar dull ache in her chest. She had learned to compartmentalize this pain, to pack it away like winter clothes. She was a Davenport. Davenports did not make scenes. They endured. Crystal's eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered over to Catherine. They settled on the necklace. "Oh, Catherine, that's a lovely piece. Very historical." The word historical was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel meant to wound. It was their favorite insult. Catherine was old world and antique. They were the future. "It was my grandmother's," Catherine said, her chin held high. "How sweet," Crystal said, her lips pulling back in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned back to Alistair. "I was just closing the acquisition of Arrow North. Their board folded an hour ago. We got it for a song." "That's my girl." Alistair beamed, squeezing her arm. "A killer in heels. We should celebrate tonight, after this dreary hospital thing, of course." The dreary hospital thing that would raise over $10 million for pediatric cancer research. The dreary hospital thing that Catherine had poured her soul into for 6 months. She said nothing. She merely picked up her clutch and walked towards the door. "The car is waiting." The gala was a sea of glittering gowns and dark tuxedos at the city's most opulent hotel ballroom. Catherine moved through the crowd with practiced grace, a queen in her element. Here the name Davenport still meant something more than just money. It meant legacy integrity. Donors and board members greeted her with genuine warmth and respect. She saw Alistair and Crystal across the room. They weren't being discreet. He had his arm wrapped possessively around Crystal's waist as he introduced her to a banking magnate. They were laughing heads close together. At one point, Crystal glanced over at Catherine, caught her eye, and whispered something in Alistair's ear. He threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried across the ballroom. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through Catherine's carefully constructed composure. It wasn't just the affair. It was the mockery. It was the blatant public disrespect in a space she considered sacrosanct. They weren't just cheating. They were enjoying rubbing her face in it. Later, during the live auction, Catherine was on stage speaking about a new wing for the neonatal intensive care unit. She spoke with passion and eloquence, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. As the bidding began on a Patek Philippe watch Alistair had donated at her insistence, she saw him at his table. Crystal was leaning into him, her lips against his ear. He was nodding, a smirk on his face. He picked up his phone, typed something, and showed it to Crystal. She giggled, covering her mouth as she looked directly at Catherine on the stage. Catherine faltered for a second, her words catching in her throat. What had he typed? "Look at her up there playing the saint. So boring. Can't wait to get you home." She recovered quickly, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped, if only for a moment. In that instant, under the hot stage lights, surrounded by the city's elite, Catherine Davenport Finch felt a profound shift. The dull ache of endurance was sharpening. It was turning into something harder, something colder. It was turning into resolve. When she stepped off the stage to a round of thunderous applause, her polite smile was a mask of iron. As she passed their table, she heard Alistair say to Crystal, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "See? She's good at that sort of thing. Charity. It keeps her busy." He thought he was consigning her to a life of irrelevance. He believed her world was small and insignificant, a quaint hobby. He and Crystal were the main event. She was the opening act nobody watched. Walking back to her own seat, Catherine's hand instinctively went to her grandmother's necklace. It wasn't just historical. It was foundational. And Alistair, in his blinding arrogance, had forgotten one crucial thing about foundations: you can't build an empire without one. And sometimes the person you ignore is the one standing on the bedrock. The last laugh, she thought, wouldn't be his. It would be hers. And it would be devastating. The weeks following the gala were an exercise in escalating audacity. Alistair, buoyed by his recent business victories and Crystal's fawning admiration, shed the last vestiges of discretion. It was as if he and Crystal were engaged in a perverse competition to see how far they could push Catherine before she broke. Crystal started appearing at their penthouse more frequently, always under the guise of late-night work sessions. Catherine would hear their laughter echoing from Alistair's home office, a sound that curdled the quiet of the sprawling apartment. She found Crystal's expensive leather briefcase by the front door in the morning, a territorial marking. Once she found a single long blonde hair on a pillow in the guest room Crystal often used to freshen up. The staff, loyal but terrified of Alistair, would avert their eyes, their silence a testament to the household's unspoken truth. The breaking point, however, did not come in the sterile quiet of their home. It came as so many society dramas do at the exclusive Glenview Country Club, a bastion of old money and manicured lawns where the Davenports had been members since its founding. It was a brilliant Saturday in June. Catherine was hosting a small luncheon for the Hospital Foundation's key patrons. It was a relaxed affair on the terrace overlooking the 18th green. The conversation was light, the iced tea was sweet, and for a few hours Catherine felt a semblance of peace. Then Alistair arrived. Unannounced. He strode onto the terrace dressed in golf attire that shouted its expense. And right behind him, like a brightly colored venomous snake, was Crystal, clad in tennis whites, so pristine they seemed to have been created that morning. A hush fell over Catherine's table. The ladies, all from families who understood protocol and decency, looked from Catherine to Alistair, and back again, their polite smiles freezing on their faces. "Catherine, darling," Alistair boomed, feigning surprise. "Didn't realize you'd be here. Crystal and I just finished a round. Thought we'd grab a bite." He was lying. His golf shoes were immaculate, not a speck of grass on them. Crystal waved a little too enthusiastically. "Hi, everyone," she chirped as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Catherine's blood ran cold. This was a calculated invasion. The country club was her territory, a place tied to her family, her identity. By bringing Crystal here, Alistair was making a statement nowhere was safe for her. Nothing was sacred. His world was subsuming hers entirely. "Alistair," Catherine said, her voice dangerously level, "this is a private luncheon." "Oh, don't be so stuffy," he scoffed, pulling a chair from an empty table and placing it next to his wife. He gestured for Crystal to do the same. "There's plenty of room. We won't be long." The other women at the table were mortified. They offered tight-lipped, awkward greetings to Crystal, who preened under the attention. Alistair proceeded to dominate the conversation loudly, recounting a recent corporate raid, peppering his story with financial jargon designed to impress and exclude. Crystal would interject with details, playing the part of the indispensable partner. "And the best part," Alistair was saying, "is that their CEO, poor old Henderson, never saw it coming. We used a subsidiary holding company, a ghost corp, really, to buy up the debt. By the time he realized what was happening, we owned him. He was practically crying in the boardroom." Crystal laughed. He kept talking about a gentleman's agreement. So quaint. Catherine sat in stony silence, the perfect hostess mask cemented to her face. But beneath it she was listening. Really listening. Alistair had always been dismissive of her intelligence, especially in business. He'd pat her head and tell her not to worry her pretty little head with the complexities of his work. Because of this, he had grown careless. He mentioned the name of the holding company they'd used, Argent Allied Partners. The name snagged in Catherine's mind. Argent, silver, Allied. It sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. The excruciating lunch finally ended. Alistair and Crystal departed as brazenly as they had arrived, leaving a crater of social awkwardness in their wake. Catherine's guests, ever polite, made their excuses and left quickly, their pity hanging in the air like cheap perfume. Left alone at the table, Catherine stared out at the perfect green, her mind racing. Argent Allied Partners. Why did that name bother her? She spent the rest of the weekend in a fog, the name echoing in her thoughts. On Monday morning, she went to her late father's study. It was a room Alistair never entered, filled with old leather-bound books, maritime maps, and generations of Davenport family records. Her father, Augustus Davenport, had been a quiet, formidable man. A shipping magnate who had diversified the family's old-world fortune into modern investments with shrewd, silent precision. He had passed away 3 years ago, leaving Catherine a substantial but complex inheritance, managed by the family's long-time legal firm. She went to his old mahogany desk and began opening drawers. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A feeling, a clue. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a stack of old property deeds, she found a set of leather-bound journals. Her father's private ledgers. She opened the one from 10 years ago, the year she and Alistair were married. Her father hadn't been thrilled about the match. "He's too loud, Catherine," he'd said. "Men who have to shout about their success are often standing on hollow ground." She flipped through the pages filled with her father's elegant cursive script. It was mostly notes on shipping routes, commodity prices, stock performances. And then she saw it. An entry dated a week after her wedding, meeting with Abernathy. Established new holding coder for Alistair's initial venture capital. A safety net. He must believe it's his own victory. Call it Argent Allied Partners. He'll like the sound of it. A wedding gift of a different sort. Let's see what the boy can build in the sandbox. Catherine dropped the journal. The heavy book hit the Persian rug with a dull thud. The room spun. A sandbox. A safety net. Argent Allied Partners wasn't a ghost corp Alistair had brilliantly created. It was a wedding gift from her father. A pre-funded entity designed to give her ambitious new husband the seed capital and connections he needed to get started, all while making him think he had done it himself. Her father had built a sandbox for the loud, arrogant boy his daughter had married. He had given Alistair a protected playpen to build his castles, incomplete with invisible walls and a soft landing for when he fell. Alistair's entire empire, Finch Global, the source of his pride, his power, his very identity, it was all built on a lie. A lie he didn't even know existed. The mockery, the condescension, the affair with Crystal, it all took on a new, hideous dimension. He was a king, crowing from the top of a plastic castle, laughing at the woman whose family had not only built the castle, but had put it in the sandbox and supplied all the toys. Catherine slowly bent down and picked up the journal. Her hands were shaking, but not from shock anymore. It was from a surge of icy, clarifying rage. The game had changed. They thought they were playing chess and she was a forgotten pawn. They were about to find out she was the one who owned the entire board. She walked out of the study and picked up her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. "Abernathy and Cole, good morning." "It's Catherine Finch," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I need to speak with Mr. Abernathy. Immediately. Tell him it's about the sandbox." The offices of Abernathy and Cole were the antithesis of Finch Global. Where Alistair's headquarters were all glass chrome and aggressive modern art, the family law firm was a sanctuary of dark wood worn leather and the faint, comforting scent of old paper and Earl Grey tea. It was a place where secrets were kept for generations. Mr. Howard Abernathy was as much a fixture as the grandfather clock in the lobby. He was a man in his late 70s with eyes that had seen the Gilded Age fortunes of Chicago families rise and fall. He had been Augustus Davenport's closest friend and consigliere. When Catherine was shown into his office, he rose slowly, his expression a mixture of warmth and solemnity. "Catherine," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "it has been too long. I was so sorry to hear about, well, the rumors." "The rumors are true, Howard," Catherine said, dispensing with pleasantries. She sat opposite his massive oak desk. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here about the sandbox." Abernathy's eyebrows, thick and white, shot up. He sat back down, steepling his fingers. A flicker of something respect, perhaps even excitement, danced in his old eyes. "Ah, so you found the journals." "I have," Catherine said. "And now I want you to tell me everything. Every detail Alistair doesn't know. I want to see the architecture of this deception." For the next 3 hours, with the door closed and the tea growing cold, Howard Abernathy walked Catherine through the masterpiece of financial illusion her father had constructed. It was more intricate than she could have ever imagined. Argent Allied Partners was just the beginning. Augustus Davenport, deeply skeptical of Alistair's character, but wanting his daughter to be happy and secure, had devised a plan of breathtaking complexity. "Your father called it the guided venture," Abernathy explained, pulling out thick, dust-covered binders. "He didn't just give Alistair seed money. He created an entire ecosystem around him. Alistair's first genius move, buying a struggling logistics company, had been prearranged. The company was owned by another Davenport holding company. Its board was instructed by Augustus to accept Alistair's lowball offer. The crucial client contracts that suddenly materialized, saving the company and making Alistair look like a visionary. They were with businesses secretly controlled by or heavily indebted to Davenport Shipping. His first hostile takeover, the target company's primary lender, was a bank where the Davenports held a controlling interest. At a secret command from Augustus, the bank had tightened the company's credit line, making it vulnerable. Alistair just had to walk through the door her father had kicked open. Every major success Alistair has had for the first 5 years was facilitated, Abernathy said carefully. Your father's contacts in banking and politics and international trade, they were all quietly told to take Alistair's calls to give him favorable terms. He believed he was a brilliant networker, a charismatic deal-maker. In reality, he was calling a list of people who were already prepared to say yes. Catherine felt a wave of nausea. "So his entire reputation is built on a stage your father built with props your father provided and a script your father wrote," Abernathy finished. "After the first 5 or 6 years, Finch Global had enough momentum and capital to operate more independently. Your father slowly withdrew the guidance. But the foundation, the bedrock of the entire enterprise, is pure Davenport." "And the prenup?" Catherine asked, her voice a whisper. This was the document Alistair had always been so proud of. He'd had his shark-like lawyers draft it, and he'd often joked about how ironclad it was. Abernathy allowed himself a small, dry smile. "Ah, the prenuptial agreement. Alistair's masterpiece. He was so focused on protecting the future earnings of Finch Global from you. He made sure the language specified that anything generated by the company would be considered his sole and separate property in the event of a divorce." "So I get nothing from it," Catherine stated. "On the contrary," Abernathy said, leaning forward. "Your father and I reviewed his draft. We saw his focus, and we added one very simple, very elegant clause of our own. Clause 11B. Alistair's lawyers barely glanced at it, dismissing it as boilerplate." He slid a document across the desk. It was their prenup. He pointed to a paragraph of dense legalese. "It states," Abernathy translated, "that any foundational assets, seed capital, or enabling entities established by third parties and for the benefit of the marital union would, in the case of dissolution, revert to the estate of the originating party or their designated heir." Catherine read it twice. Her heart began to pound. "And foundational assets includes..." "It includes, by a very specific and legally documented trail, Argent Allied Partners and the 3 other primary holding companies your father used to build the sandbox," Abernathy confirmed, "which means in the event of a divorce, the very seed from which Finch Global grew and all assets directly traceable to it, which is to say the controlling interest in the entire company, reverts to you as your father's designated heir." Catherine stared at the lawyer, her mind reeling. Alistair hadn't just been played, he had been checkmated 10 years before the game even started. His ironclad prenup wasn't a shield to protect his assets from her. It was a self-destruct mechanism that would hand his entire empire over to her. He thinks it protects him. She breathed, a disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. He was so busy ensuring you couldn't take a slice of his pie, Abernathy said, that he never bothered to check who owned the bakery. The nausea was gone, replaced by a feeling of dizzying power. This was better than revenge. This was poetic justice of a cosmic order. There's more, Abernathy added, his tone sobering. Alistair has grown reckless. He's leveraging the company to its absolute limit for this new Odyssey project, the satellite network. He's using Finch Global's core assets as collateral. Catherine knew about the Odyssey project. It was his obsession, his legacy project, the thing he and Crystal were always whispering about. It was wildly ambitious and incredibly risky. What does that mean for me? She asked. It means that the assets he's gambling with are legally about to become your assets, Abernathy explained. If he defaults, the creditors could seize control of the company. The timing of this is critical. You hold the trigger. The question is, when do you pull it? Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling Chicago streets. Alistair and Crystal saw her as a relic, a society wife playing with charities. They had no idea that her name, her legacy, was the very thing that gave them the power they so arrogantly wielded. She turned back to Abernathy, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he hadn't seen since her father was alive. Alistair is trying to have me removed from the board of the hospital foundation, she said. He told one of the other board members that my sentimental approach is hindering modern fundraising opportunities. He wants to install Crystal in my place. Abernathy's jaw tightened. An insult to your family's legacy. It's more than an insult, Catherine said. It's the perfect stage. He's going to call a special board meeting to vote me out. He thinks it will be his ultimate triumph, the final symbolic act of replacing me. He has no idea what's coming. She looked at the old lawyer, a true smile finally reaching her eyes. Howard, I want you to prepare everything. The filings, the injunctions, the ownership transfer, everything. I'll let Alistair call his meeting. I'll let him gather his allies. I want him and Crystal to be standing in the center of the room at the absolute peak of their arrogance. Her voice dropped to a near whisper laced with steel. And then we're not just going to take back the sandbox. We're going to demolish the castle. Alistair Finch felt invincible. The Odyssey project was coming together, a constellation of low-orbit satellites that would revolutionize global data transfer. It was his moonshot, his legacy. Crystal, ever the brilliant executor of his vision, had secured the final round of financing, a massive leveraged loan that used nearly every solid asset in Finch Global as collateral. It was a bet-the-company move, and Alistair had never felt more alive. With his future legacy secured, he turned his attention to tidying up the last relic of his past, Catherine. Her position as chair of the Children's Hospital Foundation was an annoyance. It gave her a platform, a sphere of influence that, while quaint in his eyes, still bore the respected Davenport name. Crystal, who craved the legitimacy that came with high society philanthropy, wanted the position for herself. For her, it was the final jewel in the crown of her conquest. For Alistair, it was a simple matter of house cleaning. He did it with his signature blend of corporate brutality and personal cruelty. He systematically called every member of the foundation's board. To some, he spoke of modernizing, of leveraging the foundation's assets for higher returns, painting Catherine as a well-meaning but hopelessly outdated manager. To others, he hinted at Catherine's fragile state, following their marital difficulties, suggesting she needed to be relieved of the pressure. He promised a massive personal donation from Finch Global to the foundation the moment a more dynamic leadership was in place, a thinly veiled bribe. The special board meeting was set for a Wednesday afternoon in the hospital's oak-paneled boardroom. Alistair was humming as he adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the elevator doors. Crystal stood beside him, radiating triumph in a sharp crimson power suit. "Are you nervous?" he asked her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Only that I might smile too much when they announce the vote," she purred, adjusting the lapel of his jacket. "She'll be so humiliated, in front of her own people. It's perfect." "She's had it coming," Alistair said, his voice hardening, holding on to that dusty old name like it still means something. "Today they'll see that the only name that matters is Finch." When they entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The board members, a mix of old money philanthropists and corporate heavyweights, were seated around the long mahogany table. Catherine was already there, seated at the head of the table, in her designated chair. She looked unnervingly calm, dressed in a simple but elegant cream-colored dress. She offered them a brief, unreadable nod. Beside her, to Alistair's surprise, sat Howard Abernathy. "What's he doing here?" Alistair muttered to Crystal. "Bringing her family lawyer for moral support. Pathetic." Catherine called the meeting to order, her voice clear and steady. "Good afternoon, everyone. As you know, Mr. Finch has called this extraordinary meeting to propose a change in the Foundation's leadership. Alistair, the floor is yours." Alistair stood radiating confidence. He launched into his pre-prepared speech, a masterful blend of feigned respect for Catherine's past contributions and a compelling vision for a more aggressive, financially driven future under new leadership. He barely looked at Catherine, addressing the board as if she were already a ghost. "And that is why, with a heavy heart but a clear vision for the future, I move for a vote of no confidence in the current chair," he concluded. "And I would like to formally nominate Ms. Crystal Vance, whose business acumen you all know, as the new chairwoman, effective immediately." Crystal gave a modest, predatory smile. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Board members shifted in their seats. They respected Catherine, but Alistair's power and his promised donation was a potent combination. "Is there any discussion?" Catherine asked, her gaze sweeping the table. No one spoke. They looked at their papers, at the ceiling, anywhere but at her. The betrayal was silent but absolute. "Very well," Catherine said, her composure unshaken. "Before we proceed to a vote, I have a brief statement of my own, or rather my legal counsel does, as it pertains to a significant financial matter that directly impacts this foundation and indeed everyone in this room with ties to Finch Global." She nodded to Abernathy. The old lawyer stood up slowly, placing a thick leather-bound folio on the table with a soft thud. "Good afternoon." Abernathy began, his voice filling the room with an authority that had been absent from Alistair's slick presentation. "This won't take long. I am here today on behalf of my client, Catherine Davenport Finch. As of 9:15 this morning, per the execution of Clause 11B of a pre-existing marital agreement, my client has assumed controlling ownership of several foundational holding companies, most notably Argent Allied Partners." Alistair stared, his confident smirk faltering. "What the hell are you talking about? Argent Allied is a subsidiary of Finch Global." "I'm afraid you have it backwards, Mr. Finch." Abernathy continued, his tone icy. "Finch Global is for all intents and purposes a subsidiary of Argent Allied and its sister entities. Entities which, as of this morning, are under the sole control of Mrs. Finch." He let that statement hang in the air. A few of the board members who ran financial firms were beginning to look pale. They understood the implications immediately. Alistair let out a short, sharp laugh, though it sounded strained. "This is absurd, a desperate fantasy. My lawyers will tear this apart in minutes." "I invite them to try," Abernathy said calmly. "We have also this morning filed an emergency injunction in Delaware Chancery Court. The injunction freezes all major financial activities of Finch Global pending an audit to determine the precise value of the assets that now belong to Mrs. Finch." He turned his gaze directly to Alistair. "Specifically, it halts any further leveraging of company assets, for instance for something like the Odyssey project." The color drained from Alistair's face. The loan. The massive loan that was due to be drawn down tomorrow. Without it, the entire project would collapse and the default clauses would trigger. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing its booming confidence. "What kind of trick is this, Catherine?" Catherine finally looked at him. Her expression was not one of anger or hurt. It was one of utter detachment, as if she were examining an insect. "It's no trick, Alistair," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "It's just business. Something you were always so keen to teach me about. You see, you built your empire in a sandbox my father created for you. A guided venture, he called it. He wanted to see what you would do. And you did build something, but you forgot who owned the land it was built on." Crystal looked from Alistair to Catherine, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "Allie, what is she talking about?" Alistair ignored her. He was locked in a battle of wills with his wife, the woman he had dismissed as a piece of furniture. And he was losing. "You're lying," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Abernathy slid a single piece of paper down the long table. It was a copy of the court-filed injunction. Alistair's name was on it. The Odyssey Project was named explicitly. It was real. "Now about the matter of this foundation," Catherine said, reclaiming control of the meeting. "Alistair, your generous offer of a donation from Finch Global is of course now null and void, as you are no longer in a position to authorize it. In fact, given the company's uncertain future, I question whether you can afford your membership at the country club, let alone a multi-million-dollar gift." She looked around the table at the stunned board members. "I believe Mr. Finch's motion is no longer relevant. Shall we move on to the actual business of this foundation? The plans for the new neonatal wing." Alistair Finch stood frozen, his world tilting on its axis. He and Crystal had walked in here for a coronation, a final humiliating victory. Instead, they had walked into an execution. And the woman they had mocked, the quiet antique wife, was not the one being executed. She was the one holding the axe. The aftermath of the boardroom ambush was not a loud explosion, but a series of swift, silent, devastating implosions. For Alistair Finch, the world he had meticulously built began to dissolve like sandcastles in an incoming tide. He and Crystal stumbled out of the hospital boardroom in a daze. His phone was already vibrating, a frantic series of calls from his chief financial officer, his legal team, and the consortium of banks backing the Odyssey project. "What was that, Allie?" Crystal demanded, her voice shrill with panic as they stood in the hospital's sterile white hallway. The crimson of her suit suddenly looked garish. "What did she mean, sandbox? You need to fix this." "Quiet!" he snapped, his mind racing. He saw Howard Abernathy exit the boardroom, give him a nod of finality that was almost pitying, and walk away. Catherine remained inside, her voice audible as she calmly discussed fundraising strategies with the now utterly compliant board. She hadn't even bothered to watch them leave. The first domino fell before he even reached his car. The lead banker for the Odyssey loan called. The conversation was brief and brutal. The injunction filed by Catherine's lawyers had spooked the entire syndicate. With questions of ownership and control over the collateral assets, Finch Global itself, the financing was indefinitely suspended. The billion-dollar project was dead in the water. When Alistair got back to his office, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. His CFO, a man named Peterson, met him at the door, his face ashen. "The credit lines, Alistair," Peterson said, his voice low. "First National just called. They're calling our primary corporate credit line. They said something about a material adverse change in executive control." "They can't do that," Alistair roared. "They can," Peterson countered. "The covenant is tied to you maintaining majority control. Her injunction challenges that. Other banks are following suit. Our liquidity is evaporating. By the end of the day, we won't be able to make payroll." Crystal, who had followed him in, sank into a chair. The brilliant, ruthless executive was gone. In her place was a woman who was rapidly calculating her own exit strategy. The glamour of being a Titan's mistress faded quickly when the Titan was revealed to be a puppet. Her loyalty was to power and money, and both were draining from Alistair like blood from a fatal wound. "This is a legal maneuver, a bluff," Alistair said, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "My lawyers will crush it." But when he finally got his own high-priced legal team on a conference call, their tone was grim. They had reviewed the documents Catherine's team had forwarded. They were stunned. "The language in the prenup is incredibly precise, Alistair," said the lead attorney, a man known for his aggression now sounding deflated. "It's a Trojan horse. We never saw it. We were so focused on shielding future income we missed the clause about foundational assets. It's brilliant, actually." "So fix it," Alistair shouted into the speakerphone. "Fix it, Alistair. The evidence trail Abernathy has provided linking the funding of Argent Allied Partners directly to Augustus Davenport's estate is meticulous. Bank transfers, board minutes, signed affidavits. They have a perfect chain of custody. She doesn't just have a claim, she has a slam dunk." The second domino. His own legal eagles were admitting defeat. By mid-afternoon, the news had started to leak to the financial press. A vague story at first about a shareholder dispute and a leadership challenge at Finch Global. But the sharks in the water smelled blood. The company's stock, what little of it was publicly traded, began to plummet. His rivals, the ones he had crushed and gloated over, started circling, making inquiries about buying up Finch Global's debt for pennies on the dollar. Crystal watched the stock ticker on her computer screen, her face a stony mask. "The Arrow North deal is going to collapse," she said, her voice flat. "The financing was tied to our corporate credit, which no longer exists." Another domino. The deal she had been so proud of, the one they had used to mock Catherine at the gala, was turning to dust. The most painful blow came from their son, Leo. He was 17, a quiet, observant boy who had grown up in the shadow of his father's ambition. He had always been torn, loving his mother's warmth, but dazzled by his father's power and success. He called Alistair that evening. "Dad, I was with Mom this afternoon. Mr. Abernathy explained some of it," Leo said, his voice strained. "Is it true about Grandpa Davenport? Your mother is poisoning you against me, Leo." Alistair snarled. "It's a lie. A complicated, vicious lie." "Is it?" Leo asked, and for the first time Alistair heard not a boy's confusion, but a young man's judgment in his voice. "Because Mom showed me a copy of Grandpa's journal. His handwriting. I remember it. He wrote about building you a sandbox. He said he hoped you'd build something worthy of her." There was a painful pause. "Did you—" Click. Leo hung up. The personal domino. The one that cracked Alistair's soul. He sat alone in his vast office as dusk fell, the glittering city lights coming on outside his window. The view no longer looked like a kingdom. It looked like a world that was utterly indifferent to him. The calls had stopped. The panic had subsided into a dead-heavy silence. The door opened. It was Crystal. She was carrying her handbag and a small box containing the personal items from her desk. She didn't look at him. "My lawyers will be in touch with yours," she said, her voice as cold and transactional as if they were discussing a failed acquisition. "Regarding my severance package and my stock options." Alistair stared at her. "My stock options, Crystal, there is no more company. It's over. The options were part of my employment contract," she said, unmoved. "I'll take whatever they're worth, or I'll sue for wrongful termination. Goodbye, Alistair." She walked out without a backward glance. The ultimate betrayal, so swift and passionless it was almost comical. She wasn't just leaving a sinking ship, she was stripping it for parts on her way out. Alistair Finch was finally completely alone. He had lost his company, his reputation, his mistress, and his son's respect, all in the space of 8 hours. He leaned back in his ridiculously expensive ergonomic chair and looked at his reflection in the dark window. He saw not a titan, not a king, but a fool. A loud, arrogant man who had danced and preened on a stage he hadn't built, who had mocked the architect, and who was now standing in the ruins after she had quietly, calmly, and completely brought the entire theater down around him. The silence was absolute. The fall was complete. A week later, Alistair found himself summoned to a place he hadn't set foot in for years, the downtown offices of Abernathy & Cole. His own lawyers had advised him to go. "It's not a negotiation, Alistair," they'd said. "It's a surrender. Go listen and sign what they put in front of you. It's your only path to avoiding complete personal bankruptcy and a litany of shareholder lawsuits." He walked into the wood-paneled conference room feeling like a condemned man. The room felt heavy with the weight of history of a power he had never understood. Catherine was already there, seated at the head of the long table. She was not alone. Mr. Abernathy sat to her right, and to her left sat their son Leo. The boy wouldn't meet his father's eyes. Alistair took a seat opposite them, the polished mahogany surface between them feeling like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He looked terrible. He hadn't slept. His expensive suit was rumpled, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow, defeated glare. "Alistair!" Catherine began, her voice calm and measured. It held no triumph, no glee, only a profound and unsettling finality. "Thank you for coming. We have some things to finalize." Mr. Abernathy slid a thick stack of documents across the table. "This is a comprehensive settlement agreement, Alistair," the lawyer said. "It outlines the transfer of all controlling interests in the foundational holding companies to Mrs. Finch. As a result, she now holds a 72% stake in what was formerly known as Finch Global." Alistair flinched at the phrase, "what was formerly known." "The company will be restructured and rebranded." Catherine continued, speaking directly to him for the first time. "It will be taken private. I will be assuming the role of executive chairwoman. The name Finch will be removed from it entirely." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the last bricks of his identity. "The Odyssey project is cancelled," she went on. "The leveraged debt you took on has been renegotiated by Mr. Abernathy. We were able to avert total collapse, but the company's value is less than half of what it was 2 weeks ago. Your recklessness almost destroyed everything." "My recklessness?" Alistair finally found his voice, a ragged rasp. "My genius built that company. Your father gave me a toy, and I turned it into an empire. You would have had nothing without me." It was Leo who responded. He looked up, his eyes filled with a sad disappointment that was far more wounding than hatred. "She would have had Grandpa's entire fortune, Dad," he said quietly. "What she has now is just the broken pieces of what you almost gambled away." Alistair stared at his son, speechless. The boy he had dismissed, the son he had tried to dazzle with wealth and power, saw the truth with painful clarity. "As for your personal settlement," Abernathy interjected, bringing the focus back to the papers, "Catherine is being generous." Catherine spoke again. "The prenup you were so proud of gives me the right to leave you with nothing. It was designed to protect the company's assets, which are now legally mine. Your personal accounts have been frozen as they contain funds co-mingled from corporate accounts we now control." Alistair felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He was utterly at her mercy. "However," she said, "I have no desire to see the father of my son destitute. The penthouse, which is in my name as it was purchased with funds from my family trust, will be sold. You will be given 1 week to vacate and remove your personal belongings. From the proceeds of the sale, a trust will be established for you. It will provide you with an annual stipend of $60,000. $60,000. It was less than he used to spend on watches in a year. It was a clerical salary. It was a life of utter crushing mediocrity. It was in its own way a fate worse than poverty. It was irrelevance. "You'll be able to live comfortably, if not lavishly," Catherine stated, a clinical edge to her voice. "There is one condition." "A condition?" he repeated numbly. "You will sign a non-disclosure and a non-compete agreement of lifetime duration," Abernathy said. "You will never speak of the inner workings of Finch Global or the Davenport family. You will not work in or consult in the field of private equity or corporate finance anywhere in North America or Europe. You will, for all professional purposes, cease to exist." It was the final nail in the coffin. She wasn't just taking his money and his company. She was taking his name, his past, and his future. She was erasing him from the world he had fought so hard to conquer. He looked across the table at her, the woman he had called an antique, a relic. He saw no hint of the quiet, accommodating wife he had known. Her eyes were clear and hard as diamonds. She held all the cards and she was playing them with a precision that would have made her father proud. He finally understood. He had mistaken her patience for weakness, her silence for submission, her grace for irrelevance. "And what about her?" Alistair asked, a last pathetic flicker of spite in his voice. "What about Crystal? Does she get a settlement too?" Catherine allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. It was cold, sharp, and utterly dismissive. Ms. Vance's employment was terminated for cause. As for her stock options, they were options on the stock of a company that is for all intents and purposes now worthless. Her contract is void. Mr. Abernathy received a call from her lawyer yesterday. Apparently she believes she has a claim for palimony. Catherine paused, letting the absurdity hang in the air. I believe Howard's exact response was, "Good luck with that." The final humiliating detail. Crystal the victor, the queen-in-waiting, was left with nothing but a worthless contract and a mountain of legal fees. Alistair looked down at the pen resting beside the stack of documents. There was nothing left to fight for. No angle to play. He was utterly comprehensively beaten. He had been so focused on the prize he never saw the trap it was sitting in. Slowly, his hand shaking, he picked up the pen. He began to sign page after page, signing away his empire, his identity, his life's work. With each stroke, he wasn't just signing a legal document. He was signing a confession to the greatest delusion of his life, the belief that he had ever, for one single moment, been the master of his own destiny. 1 year later, the Children's Hospital Foundation Gala was held once again in the same opulent hotel ballroom. The atmosphere, however, was different. A palpable buzz of energy and respect filled the room. The new Davenport-led era of the foundation was a resounding success. At the center of it all stood Catherine Davenport. She was not the chairwoman anymore. She had taken the title of president of the newly formed Davenport Philanthropic Group, which now managed all her family's charitable endeavors with the hospital as its crown jewel. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, the color of new beginnings, and of course money. Around her neck, she wore her grandmother's sapphire necklace. Tonight, it didn't look historical, it looked regal. She moved through the room, not with the quiet endurance of the past, but with an easy, commanding confidence. People didn't greet her with pitying warmth. They approached her with deference, eager for a moment of her time. She was no longer Alistair Finch's wife. She was Catherine Davenport, the formidable head of a financial and philanthropic powerhouse. The restructured company, now named North Star Holdings, was leaner, more stable, and quietly respected. She had proven to be as shrewd and capable as her father, with an added layer of modern ethics he'd sometimes lacked. Leo stood beside her for much of the evening, handsome and composed in his first proper tuxedo. He was a freshman at the University of Chicago studying economics. The tension and sadness had left his face replaced by a quiet pride as he watched his mother. He had spent the year watching her work, seeing her true strength, and he was in awe of her. Mr. Abernathy, now comfortably in a semi-retired advisory role, watched them from a nearby table, a satisfied smile on his face. He caught Catherine's eye and raised his glass in a silent toast. She returned it with a genuine, brilliant smile. The last laugh wasn't a single cackling moment of triumph. It was this. It was the sustained, quiet hum of a life reclaimed and a legacy secured. It was seeing her son proud, her family name honored, and her own capabilities realized. As Catherine was speaking with the mayor, she happened to glance towards the hotel entrance. A man was being politely but firmly turned away by security. He was arguing, gesticulating wildly. He was dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. His face was puffy and his hair was unkempt. It took her a moment to recognize him. It was Alistair. He had apparently tried to crash the gala, perhaps hoping for a confrontation, a scene, a way to feel relevant again. But his name was not on any list. He was a nobody. He had no power here. The security guards, efficient and impassive, escorted him out into the cold Chicago night. No one in the ballroom even noticed. He was a ghost at a feast he had once hosted. Catherine watched for a moment, and for the first time she felt a sliver of something akin to pity. He was a man hollowed out, a king who had discovered his crown was made of cardboard, His entire identity had been a performance, and she had simply struck the set. She turned away back to her conversation, the brief interruption forgotten. Later that evening, a junior reporter from a society magazine approached her. "Mrs. Finch, I mean Ms. Davenport." The young woman stammered, "Everyone is saying you're the most powerful woman in Chicago. After everything that happened. Do you have any comment on your ex-husband?" Catherine considered the question for a moment. Her last laugh wasn't for him to hear. It wasn't about him at all anymore. It was for herself. She smiled serenely at the reporter. "Who?" she asked. The ultimate revenge wasn't ruin. It was irrelevance. And in that single dismissive word, Catherine Davenport finally and completely had the last laugh. And so Catherine Davenport's story comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet patience, the deep-rooted intelligence, and the underestimated grace of a person who knows their own worth, even when others try to devalue it. Alistair and Crystal made the fatal mistake of judging a book by its cover, never bothering to read the story of legacy and power written in its pages. They learned the hard way that you should never, ever underestimate the quiet ones. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate move? Was it pure genius or cold-hearted revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you love stories of sweet justice and seeing the underdog triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder of their own hidden power. And most importantly, click subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story of justice served. Thank you for listening.